Okay, so I want to welcome everybody here, as well as Sean Yeager, who's going to do our webinar for us. I think short introductions will be fine. I'm Benito Trollip, I'm the Afrikaans researcher at SARILA, focusing on evaluative constructions and using emotions in language.
I'm Deon du Plessis, the English researcher. I focus primarily on phonetics and sociolinguistics.
I'm Muzi Matunja, Siswati researcher. I focus mainly on pragmatics as well as sociolinguistics.
I'm Dimakato Martin. My interest is on part of speech takers, including the dialects that we have here in South Africa.
Cool. My name is Masubidi Sitaka. I am the Sesotho researcher focusing on lexicography.
Cool. I'm Ati Delanga. I'm coordinating SADLAR, but I'm really a literature professor interested in the works of Joseph Conrad.
Cool. Thank you all for being here. Oh, hello.
Yes, and
is that Valencia?
Introduction.
Hi, Sean.
How's it going, Valencia?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, doing well.
We just did a few introductions with the name and.
Does he have to introduce us?
Yeah, because
sure.
Like first name basis.
Oh no, I'm this is on a researcher here at SARILA.
Ah, cool.
You'll tell us later.
I guess, shall we get started then, or?
Yeah, I just want to say the format. Sean said if anybody has questions, because we are a smaller group, we can maybe just raise our hands and he'll answer the questions as they come up for everyone as he's presenting. Okay.
Cool. Okay then. The title of this talk is Visualizing the Temporal Space of Narratives, and I will get into what that term means exactly during the talk. A quick overview. I'm going to review some key terms from narratology, then go into my method, which was developed in response to the text that I've been looking at, then discuss some results, show you some of the visualizations that I've come up with, and then talk a little bit about some of the directions that I feel like this work can go in. So I'm working at the intersection of three fields. Digital humanities doesn't need any introduction for y'all. Using digital techniques to gain new perspectives on humanistic objects of study. My work is very data-driven. I started off by looking at the texts and then building my method around them. And the field often emphasizes visualization, so my work fits in with that quite well. The narratology end, for me, narratology deals with the mechanics of storytelling. And it's very intermediate. I was at the narratology conference shortly before the DH conference, and it's highly intermediate. There will be people presenting on literature on the same panel as folks presenting on video games, as film, as sometimes poetry, music. What's important is that you're taking a look at a narrative, and so it kind of isn't restricted to any one medium. And then, and for this part down here, I really want to emphasize that this is my perspective, that narratology is more about the how of storytelling than the why. It's more about these are the techniques that the author is using and putting that in the forefront, as opposed to why these particular techniques are being deployed. And that will relate to how this ties into disability studies, but I'll get to that later in the talk. classical narratology is often traced back to Gerard Genette and his book Narrative Discourse. And two key terms that I'll be using a lot throughout are fabula and sujet. Fabula is the timeline of events within the story itself, whereas sujet is the order in which these events are presented. So if you're watching a film, sujet is how many seconds the film has been running. If you're reading a book, you can approximate sujet by how many pages into the book you are. Whereas fabula will be the timeline that the characters experience. So one way to consider this is that fabula is the character's timeline, sujet is the reader's. Anachronies will occur when the order of the fabula does not match the order of the sujet. And within narrative discourse, Genette lays out a framework for tracking these. And he uses a number to represent order in the sujet and a letter to represent an order in the fabula. So each scene can be represented in terms of a letter and a number. And you can sort of use that to play Battleship or Bingo to place them on a graph. And that's what my work does, which I'll show in a second. And I want to say now that this is a drastic oversimplification because so many works really make a point of destabilizing the fabula, of destabilizing the sujet even. And Brian Richardson does a great job of looking at some of the ways that occurs and tracking some of the techniques for disrupting classical narratology. How authors say, look, time is way more complicated than ABCD. And I have some more on that in my extra slides if folks are interested. Just let me know. We can jump to that later on. What myself and others have realized is that you can use Genette's framework to create graphs. Will Nellis and Linda Williams independently coined the term time maps. We stumbled across this at around the same time. They published first. And within the main PowerPoint here, all of the time maps are ones that I've created. In the extra slides, I have some other folks' ones. And they've popped up across the internet as well without any overarching theory. And what sets my work apart is that this is the most comprehensive to date attempt at studying and theorizing time maps. The main research questions are, what narratological structures do we find when we plot fabula versus sujet? And what new interpretive insights can these structures yield? So what I have here is the time map for Howard's End. Does the arrow appear over the time map when I'm scrolling? Or?
Yes, you just have to go a bit slower. It's like buffering. So.
Oh, okay, cool. So if you're familiar with Howard's End, it starts off sort of laying out introducing the characters and their relations between these two families, the Schlegels and the Wilcoxes. And then one of the characters passes away and her funeral occurs. And then we have a large ellipsis right here where things jump forward by about 2 years. And then two other of the characters, they get married. And then at the wedding, another character impregnates another character, but it was a Victorian novel, so it's talked about indirectly via umbrellas. Anyway, and then from there we have another flash forward. We have another ellipsis here, and it discusses what happens when Helen is pregnant. And then we have a quick flashback because Bast, the person who impregnated her, just disappears. And then you find out what happened to him, and then he dies, and you come to the epilogue. Now, one of the reasons why I've started with Howard's End right here is because it's in many ways considered a traditional novel. Forster doesn't really attempt to play with time too much. And a lot of folks would say that this is a linear novel, but even a straightforward novel like this is highly nonlinear because we have these instances of 2 years later, because we have these gaps. You can see that right here, this is a nonlinearity. Here is another nonlinearity. Here is another over here. So one of the arguments that Nils and Williams made that I wholeheartedly agree with is that narrative is inherently nonlinear. And Barbara Herrnstein-Smith has this wonderful quote saying that it's only art house type films or narratives that are going to be linear. And I'll show you some more ways that that manifests in a little bit. So that's it for the introduction. Any questions so far? Okay, cool. So for my data, it's all hand collected. If you're wondering about the data collection techniques, I have extra slides for that. But we can jump to that if y'all have questions. And I make these Excel spreadsheets that have a minimum of 4 columns per line segment, so that 2 of the pieces of data are so that you can get one endpoint, the other 2 are so that you can get the other endpoint, and use them to create each line segment. And then I'll have secondary columns as well to lay out a summary of the scene, and then temporal cues with page numbers on them, so I can go back and figure out where the scene lies in the fabula. Because a lot of times temporal cues, something that happened over here might be essential for figuring out when something happened over here. And I'll give you some examples later with that. And then I'll also include tertiary columns based on the work that I'm looking at. And I'll demonstrate that later as well. Another key term is the narratological chronotope, which was coined by Susan Lancer at the International Conference on Narrative in 2018. The publication for that is still forthcoming. But one of the things that she said in it is that Bakhtin's original conception of the chronotope is too vague for narratological research. It's a term that is very useful for discussing, a place where time and space interact. But personally, my background is physics, and because of that, it's kind of like, well, everything is a place where time and space interact. And on top of that, if you want to be doing analytical work, you need definitions to be very, very precise so that you can pinpoint what's being said. But a chronotope, it applies to a lot of things, or it can. Lancer coins this term narratological chronotope to specify a particular type, and she did it in such a way that matches my line segments. Now, you're going to have 5 different types of narratological chronotopes based on the angle that the line makes within my framework. It turns out that Jeanette also has 5 classical movements. And he identifies 5, throws one of them away, which had to get reclaimed by Seymour Chapman. But what you have is the pause, which is this red line down here, where the action stops in the story. If you're watching a movie, it would just be like if you're just shown a still frame for a while and no motion happens. If you're reading a book, it would just be a descriptive segment. It is a good example. And then you can also have a stretch where the action is slowed down. So that will be this green line right here. So that's when things proceed faster in the Shuzet than in the Fabula. And that is relative to a scene right here, when action is at a normal pace. In a film, it's easy to conceptualize as a scene being shot in real time. In text, it's a little bit more difficult, and Jeanette frames it in terms of relative to other scenes. So if the novel seems to have a particular rhythm, a particular pattern, but then one scene takes a lot longer to unfold than another, that scene would be a stretch. But if another part is abbreviated, just kind of says, oh, and then they did this, that, on the other hand, would be a summary, where you're given a lot of information about something in a very short amount of textual space. And then lastly, you have an ellipsis, which is when actions are omitted. Sometimes you'll be given a brief indicator with that, something like 2 years later, or shortly later, things like that. And that'll be a jump forward in the action. And I mentioned temporal cues a little bit earlier. And temporal cues are how I figure out where different scenes lie with respect to each other in the Fabula. And I've identified two particular kinds. While I was at Digital Humanities, I was talking with Joanna Drucker, and it turns out that she has also written about this a little bit. I haven't had time yet to go back and read her writings, but that's something that I will be incorporating in the future. Absolute cues are quantitative cues that carry a fixed numeric date. When I'm collecting my data, I'm always thrilled to find an absolute cue because they're very easy to handle usually. They're sometimes foregrounded, like when a scene opens up with a particular date. But they're sometimes backgrounded, like the Rodney King protests in Black Panther in the opening scenes. They're shown on a television in the background. And because of that, you know that the scene is occurring in April or May 1992. And you can use that to figure out when things are placed. Relative cues are qualitative, and they describe the order of events. And they're usually intuited by context, as opposed to being directly given to you. And they will generally restrict a scene to a particular range of values. So let's say that you have absolute cues for scenes A and scene C, and you know B needs to occur in between. That's a relative cue for B. And I want to say that these are not fixed perfectly. They sometimes sort of bleed into each other. So in 500 Days of Summer, you can use the character's clothing to figure out when some of the scenes are ordered with respect to each other, because most of them open up with a numerical value, day 307 or something like that, but they don't all. But you can look at their costumes to figure out when things sync up. And being a physicist, I always have to say, here is the model. No, it is more complex. And I want to mention that achrony is another possibility. And it's traditionally been used as an umbrella term for the absence of cues. And it's more complicated than this, but the complexities are, by definition, post-classical, because they lie outside of Jeanette's framework. And Jeanette has his whole book, Narrative Discourse. He has like 2 paragraphs dedicated to achrony and says, it's hard. Richardson is a very good place for beginning to flesh out some of what makes these things post-classical. And if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to dive into that. That's actually one of the directions that my current research is heading in, is looking into what breaks the system. But it's more complicated than just saying, oh, it's achrony. And what I found is there's roughly 4-ish kinds of narrative. And again, these are not dead set as well. These are just sort of patterns that I've noticed. And it is not, most works you can't pin into exactly one of these categories. There's a lot of spillover. But cardinal narratives give lots and lots of absolute cues. So 500 Days of Summer is the poster child of cardinal narratives, because almost every scene opens up with telling you what day it is. Citizen Kane, though, is also a cardinal narrative, because it doesn't tell you every single exact scene, but you can figure out most of them. And then there's a few that you need to figure out using relative cues, but most of them provide some absolute cues. Ordinal narratives will provide few absolute cues, but lots of relative cues. So Rashomon is a poster child for ordinal narratives. And you're not given the exact timing of things, but you have a very good sense of when they occur with respect to each other. And same with Pulp Fiction. And this is one thing that I've been trying to work with, is being able to generate these maps without having necessarily all of the precise information that should be possible. Hybrid narratives will give you lots of both, and books tend to be hybrid. And A Visit from the Goon Squad is one of my favorites. I'll show you that. Breakfast of Champions is also fantastic. And that's a text where I included tertiary information. Anti-chronicle narratives is, anti-chronicle is a term coined by Richardson, and it's where the author is actively messing with you. And sometimes you just simply cannot create a time map. Up the Old Goat Road by Don Rafael is a fantastic short story that it's impossible to decide whether the events are unfolding over the course of a single afternoon or over the course of the narrator's lifetime as they continually reflect back on that afternoon. Synecdoche, New York is another great example. Kaufman just really just blurs the lines between dream and reality, and then you just don't know how much time passes between segments of the film. So that's it for my methodology. Just want to check in. Any questions or?
Wow. Sorry, just hold on quickly.
Hello. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Your motivation for the text. You mentioned it earlier on that you don't go for linear, well, you have to use how it's in as a kind of linear text. But these all seem. What is your motivation for the selection of text?
Oh, yes. Excellent question. Oh, hello, sorry. The motivation for selecting these particular texts is mostly that they have enough timing cues to create a time map. Okay. So I was mostly choosing the text to try and avoid narratives that are anti-chronicle. And that's also why a lot of my texts aren't necessarily written. And, oh. Hey. So, I guess, does that make sense for why I've been choosing these texts, or?
You mentioned that they're not necessarily written. What do you mean by that? Or like visual?
Like they could be film.
Okay.
One of the texts that I've been wanting to look at is a video game, Chrono Trigger. Been wanting to do some songs as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Okay. So temporal space as an interpretive lens. This is probably my biggest theoretical contribution, is coining this term temporal space. And it's filling in a theoretical gap. Namely that there hasn't been a good way in my research to put quantitative and qualitative conceptions of time in dialogue with one another. So I consider temporal space to be an n-dimensional space where n is at least 7.5 billion, because every single reader is going to have a different experience of time and narrative. And that's just one of the factors at play here. Another factor is going to be the time map, or time maps of the novel. That's going to be a subset of the temporal space. And it's a generalized concept to put all the temporalities in dialogue with each other. Now, you might be saying, well, this is a very abstract and weebly wobbly concept, and that's absolutely true. And considering the critiques that I was making earlier with respect to Bakhtin's chronotope, that might seem a little odd, but it's because I'm not putting temporal space forward as an analytical tool. It's more of an umbrella term. It's more a way to put different conceptions of time in dialogue with one another. The question isn't whether or not something falls into narrative's temporal space, because if you're even asking that question, it already is part of it. Basically, if you think something is part of a narrative's temporal space, go ahead, put it in there so that it can be put in dialogue with other conceptions of time. And a good way for me to think about it is in terms of a quote from Genet. He says that we can characterize the temporal stance of a narrative only by considering at the same time all the relationships it establishes between its own temporality and that of the story it tells. And so...
Sorry.
No worries. Oh, hey, James. So, the way that I think of temporal space is as all the relationships a text establishes between its own temporality and that of the story it tells. Another way to think about this is that whatever comments a text is making about time, it's going to not just tell you, it's also going to show you. If it's saying that time is highly nonlinear, it's not going to do that by telling a directly linear story. It's going to actively toy with time, with linearity. If it says that, you know, time is kind of dreamlike, it's going to manifest in the ways that the story is told. So, I can delve deeper into the results now. So Pulp Fiction is a great one for looking at this. Things open up at the diner and then jumps back to Vincent and Jules talking about La Royale with cheese, and then they recover the briefcase. And then Vincent and Mia have that date that goes terribly wrong. And then one thing that I want to point out is this line segment right here. I actually cheated a little bit, and if I were drawing that to scale, that line segment would actually be like way, way that way. And because it occurs like 20 or 30 years before the rest of the story. But I just kind of cheated a little bit and put it down there. Sometimes I'll put it below as a negative number to sort of represent that. But then after that scene, and I'll talk a little bit more about scale in a little bit. Breakfast of Champions is actually a great narrative for discussing scale. But you'll have the night of the fight after that when Butch kills a guy with his bare hands. And then there's another gap right here, another ellipsis, and Butch needs to go recover the watch. And then it ends on that note of redemption, where Butch saves Marcellus Wallace's life. And we cool? Yeah, we cool. So it ends on that note of redemption. They save each other's lives. And that is actually the last thing to happen in the fabula. But the Shusett continues onward. And it picks up exactly where this scene left off. So it's a little hard to see here, but these two scenes are the height here where this narrative lets off is at the same height as where this one picks up. And it resumes, and we get the story of what happens after the briefcase is recovered. Right here, this red line is a hypothetical situation, and it's what happens when, excuse me, they imagine what would happen if they don't solve this situation in time, if they're not able to figure out what to do with Marvin's body. But they avert that situation, so this scene actually never happens. It's a hypothetical, but it's shown on the screen, so I feel like it's still important to represent because it's still part of the narrative, even though it's not. It's kind of in a strange space there. And then eventually Vincent and Jules go back to the diner and are things loop back to the scene at the beginning, so it's in blue again. And this is the last scene to happen in the Shusett, but it also focuses on that quality of redemption, where Jules sets the robber's souls free. So by bifurcating his endings, Tarantino actually reinforces this theme of redemption. He gives you a double dose of it. Jeanette talks about how by starting in medias res, you can bifurcate beginnings. Well, it's also possible to bifurcate endings. So that's one thing that this time map makes very, very clear. Rashomon is an amazing film, and then especially from a theoretical perspective within this framework. So Rashomon, you have these people stuck at a gate in a rainstorm, and somebody shows up and says, "Why are you so sad?" And they say, "Well, we just witnessed a trial." So the red lines at the top are them being at the gate. Then it jumps down to this trial and what's happening there. And at the trial, they bring in witnesses, which are these lines at the bottom. And each witness tells a different version of the same crime. They all put their own spin on it. So each retelling is shown in a different color there. And one thing that really stands out here is that these two different frameworks for parallel storytelling manifest as parallel lines. You have nested storytelling, which is lines that are vertically offset from one another: the gate, the trial, and the crime. But then you also have a repeated retelling of the same event, which manifests as horizontally offset lines. So all of a sudden you have a geometric way, a geometric inroad to understanding the narrative's stance on time. Rope was my favorite time map to make because I just had to watch the movie and put 2 dots. Because it's kind of told as a gimmick where it's a whole film shot in real time. So this was a very easy time map to create. And it is in many ways a linear story. In other ways, it's not quite, because sometimes the characters talk about what happened in their childhood. So you could debate and say, oh, that's part of the narrative, that belongs in there. But what the audience is shown is directly linear. Mrs. Dalloway, though, is often considered a linear text in terms of Clarissa's day, even though Woolf just has a very, very fluid conception of time, of consciousness, and this is actually, okay, sorry, I just wanted to check. This is just the main story arc for Mrs. Dalloway. If you show the full story, you'll actually have something that kind of looks like Rashomon, because there are flashbacks to World War I and then other flashbacks to a character's visit to India. But if you look at the present story of Mrs. Dalloway, it's actually very, very closely linear. But it's not quite linear because of what happens at lunchtime right around here. Woolf uses lunch to really unpack what the characters are doing and to tell us about them. So there's a little bit of a plateau there. If you run an R-squared on this data, it turns out that Mrs. Dalloway's about 0.91. So it's not quite linear, but it's still highly linear. Whereas with Rope, the R-squared would be exactly 1. And if you take a look at the chapter 40-Minute Lunch with Kitty Jackson from A Visit from the Goon Squad, the R-squared for that is 0.93. But it's a little bit more so, but it's still not quite. And this really just manifests very directly a distinction between media, where with film it's relatively simple to do linear storytelling, just real time, but with text it's incredibly, incredibly difficult. And Big Ben is practically a character in Mrs. Dalloway, but it's still very difficult to pin down when things happen. 500 Days of Summer is also a very interesting film structurally because it has a reputation for being highly anachronous, but there's still kind of a backbone main story that I've shown in red that can be followed. And it's interspersed with these flash forwards in green of the two main characters, their relationship. But the film opens up with the end of that relationship, which I've shown right here. And that kind of serves as a midpoint of the film, where things, it's just a turning point. And if you look at where the breakup occurs in terms of the Fabula and the Shuzette, you get this, it splits the film into quadrants. And down here, you have the story of the relationship. Up here, you have the aftermath of the relationship. But then in the lower right quadrant, it's the lines in blue are revisiting the lines in green, but the emotional balance is flipped. Here, we're seeing happy scenes of a relationship and development. Over here, we're seeing the things that weren't so good about the relationship. But it's the same scenes. So the temporal inversion corresponds to an emotional inversion. And then up here, there aren't too many scenes. There's just one when they sort of make peace with one another. And then there's another scene just when they try being friends, but things don't go quite well. So this really demonstrates how time and emotion are linked. And it's a geometric way to display that. Citizen Kane is really cool because it actually traces out a triangle. You have the film opens up, Kane says Rosebud and dies. And that's the first thing that we as the audience see. And then you have these reporters who try to figure out what Rosebud is. And they start off by watching this film about what happens in Kane's life. And that's in green right here. And then you have the story of the reporters interviewing people who knew Kane. And those are the lines in black up here. But then each of them tells a different segment of Kane's life down here, which is sort of the hypotenuse of this triangle. And the hypotenuse is, it's not linear. You have ellipses here. You have a montage, which is sort of replicates a vertical line, but not quite. So it's kind of pseudo-linear, but close. But one thing that's very interesting about Kane is that almost every scene lies along the perimeter of this triangle, except for one. This scene right here, where he needs to sell the newspaper back to Thatcher, that actually lies right about in the middle of the triangle. Within this interpretive framework, it's literally the core of the film. It's that failed ambition. It's that he's trying to control the world by saying, I say what the news is, but he fails at that. So that's at the center of the film. But what's lying at the perimeter? What's defining the triangle? Well, in the upper left-hand corner, we have Rosebud. It's his last words. Then, spoiler alert, we see him sledding as a child on his sled, Rosebud. It's kind of the bottom corner of the triangle. And then at the end of the film, we see his possessions are being distributed, and the sled Rosebud gets thrown into a fire. So the points of the triangle are actually defined by Rosebud. So all of a sudden you have an inversion of this traditional interpretation of the film, where the core of Kane is usually said to be his inner childhood, Rosebud, representing that. That's what he's been holding on to. This flips it. It says that Rosebud is the outer shell of Kane's story. It's the story that he constructed for himself. But what's really at his core is this failed ambition. So it gives a new interpretive framework. And I'm not going to say that it is the framework, but it's one way to understand the film. Breakfast of Champions is great. Kurt Vonnegut, he makes an offhand reference to the Adirondack Mountains being formed about 500 million years ago. And then he talks about the dinosaurs going extinct 65 million years ago. And then all of human history is just collapsed into this blue line, because human history is only like 10 or 15,000 years old, something like that. So just by scale, it's just nothing compared to the geological scale that things are going on. So I think this is something that Vonnegut would love, is just that everything that we have ever done just pales in comparison to these offhand references to the Earth's history. But of course, from our perspective, there's just so much that's happening because human history is rich and filled with so many things. So this demonstrates why scale is so important for discussing narratives. If we zoom in a little bit to the main storyline, all of a sudden, there's way more structures here that were just collapsed into a flat line up here. And within Vonnegut's setup, this is where I have tracked tertiary information. And I've tracked which characters are present in each scene as he goes through. And in Vonnegut's words, it's the story of three old white guys. And they are Kilgore Trout, Dwayne Hoover, and Vonnegut himself, who appears as a character. And I've color-coded them in here as the three additive primaries, red, green, and blue. So scenes where Kilgore Trout is present are in blue, and just Trout. Scenes where just Dwayne Hoover is present are in red. But then if two or more of them are present, then we have the additive secondaries, and then I use black for when all three of them are present because white wouldn't appear on the background. And what happens is you have this alternation between Trout's story and Dwayne's story right here for most of the book, and it kind of makes a candy cane type pattern. But it opens up in Medias Res with Vonnegut telling us about what is going to happen when Trout and Hoover collide, when their paths intersect. And they actually end up, all three of them, coming together towards the end, which Vonnegut doesn't tell you until that happens. So we have lots and lots of foreshadowing up here about this coalescence. And then it slowly happens. Vonnegut and Hoover are in the same room together, and then Trout shows up, and then they slowly part ways again. So this is something that I'm still trying to untangle, figure out what other aspects are here. And Vonnegut includes scenes from all of human history. So there's actually a few other graphs that I want to include for this one single narrative. This is another story that I'm still working on unpacking, Assata Shakur's autobiography. You can see that it's actually very similar to Breakfast of Champions through its use of in medias res, and also in the fact that Assata jumps back and forth between talking about her time in prison and telling you her life story. She was a political prisoner in the US, but eventually escaped and fled to Cuba, where she still is today. And the book starts off with a chart showing her trial date. So all of this clustering of green dots corresponds to many things throughout her imprisonment and her trials in New Jersey. But we're also told her life story, and they eventually intersect, catch up with the trial and then her escape there. And this is another thing that I'm still trying to figure out how to unpack. I think Hortense Spillers' concept of a distinction between flesh and body might be a good way to interpret this, but I've picked out a few of my coursework, a few of my courses for this term to try and get some new theoretical perspectives here on this. And if anybody has suggestions, I'm more than happy to hear them. Another one that is very much in need of picking apart is A Visit from the Goon Squad, as well as the accompanying story Black Box by Jennifer Egan. There is structure on over 40 levels of zoom within this one book. So there is a lot here. The main storylines for each chapter are shown in red, and you can see that that jumps around a lot anyway. But then she keeps telling you other tidbits as well here and there. So there's a lot here that I am trying to unpack. One of the great things about studying contemporary literature is that you can reach out to the authors and say, hey, I made this thing. And Egan is amazing. She's like, whoa, that's awesome. I don't know what's happening here, but this is great. So that was really fun for me. She's wonderful. And so I'm mostly just showing this to say, like, time and narrative is incredibly complex. And I don't think that these graphs are going to show everything in it, but it's one possible way to explore. So I'll wrap things up now. I've been talking for a while. So I mentioned before that this is intersecting with disability studies, but I just kind of brushed over that. For me, I'm autistic, and so one question that I've always got is, why do you do this? Why should I be interested in this? What does it tell us about narrative? And for so long, the answer was, I don't know. It's kind of cool. Because I just started doing this in my spare time, and then went back and started finding theoretical sources to really develop a framework for it. And presenting this at DH, I wanted to tie this into Nyamjo's speech, which just felt like a very natural connection. Melanie Yergeau is probably the leading neuroqueer theorist, the leading autistic theorist, and she says, I am autistic, I live and dwell and will forever remain among the lacking. Autism is often defined as a lack of rhetoric. Yergeau is a rhetorician, and she says, writing this beautiful, beautiful text saying, oh, I completely lack rhetoric, therefore I'm autistic. But she's just being sarcastic with that, you know. she's using rhetorical techniques to claim that she is incapable of rhetoric. So if autism is a lack, what does that say about incompleteness of being human? And then another reason why this is important is that no other narratologists are theorizing from an explicitly autistic perspective. There are plenty of theories by neurotypicals, non-autistic folks, about how we process narrative, but as far as I can tell, I'm the first person explicitly saying, well, okay, what do autistic people say about narrative theory? And I want to emphasize that it is an autistic narratology. The whole idea of autistic narratology makes no sense because autistic folks just diverge from the norm in different ways. Time is a great example of this. Some autistic folks are incredibly, incredibly punctual and will show up exactly at every single moment. I am chronically late. I meant to show up at 8:30, and I got here at 8:40. And luckily, that's how I have to compensate for that. It's like, okay, I'll get there extra early so that I'm only a little late for being early. And then for me, I emphasize formal structures because some formal structures can be reader invariant. I don't want to say that everything is the same for all readers, but these time maps, they do present a site where different readers can agree on what the narrative is saying, or not what the narrative is saying, because different readers will interpret the time maps differently, but they can agree that the time maps share an overarching structure, which I think is very important. And returning to Nyamjo's talk, life is complex, so having a reliable form of communication is incredibly valuable. Being able to identify what folks can agree on and finding common ground is essential. And also, I believe that what I'm doing is building a deciphering practice, which is a coin termed by Sylvia Wynter. And she says that a deciphering practice is a new mode of inquiry, one that will and can, in the words of Heinz Pagel, erase the traditional barriers between the natural sciences and the humanities in order to make our narratively constructed worlds and their behavior regulating orders of feelings and beliefs, in other words, our cultural imaginaries. A deciphering practice will make them subject to scientific description in a new way. And what's incredibly important is that such a practice will reveal the rules of functioning rather than merely replicate and perpetuate these rules. So for one, we need to identify the rules of culture, the rules of culture that have been constructed. And we need to figure out ways of dismantling them for moving past these imposed hierarchies of subjugation, of oppression. So I think that by combining different approaches to literature is one way that we can build towards that. So lastly, with future work, I'm hoping to use these time maps as a way to close read some text in very, very deep detail. So I showed you the time map for A Visit from the Goon Squad. I also have data for House of Leaves and Infinite Jest, but the time maps for those are, they have not been cleaned up. So I want to do a deep dive on these texts and see what pops out. Gravity's Rainbow is another one using data from Steven Weisenberger. And then automating data collection is another possibility. But I'm very, very careful with this because my work with time as a reader has just shown that temporal language is incredibly fluid. It's very, very difficult to pin down if you can at all. And so I want to be very careful to say that this is a project that needs to be handled very, very carefully with a lot of nuance. But the stakes are that this might allow us to find patterns across eras, across genres, across cultures. I don't want to say that they do exist right now because my data set is far, far, far too small, but it might be useful for identifying patterns in how we tell stories. One potential inroad for this is research done by Ted Underwood, Yancey, and I can't remember Yancey's name. I've only met him via email, but also with Ted Underwood and David Minno from Cornell, who Yancey's working with. And these are papers that are also on my to-read list that I have not yet gotten around to, unfortunately. But top of the reading list. And also for video, Taylor Arnold and Lauren Tilton with the Distant Viewing Lab have developed some techniques that'll be very useful. They were studying Bewitched and I Love Lucy, and they were able to generate machine learning techniques that actually were very good at identifying when scenes began and ended. So that could be very useful for this. And my new position at Ohio State is I went from being an assistant professor of math and physics to being a graduate student in English. So this is potential doctoral work. So we shall see. And, oh, one more slide, conclusions. This is an interdisciplinary means of textual analysis. It visualizes structures which are isomorphic to the text. And these structures compare two types of time via space. It's formalist in nature, but it's an inroad for other interpretive strategies. I want to try and avoid the traps of early formalism, where it says like this means this. It's like no, and I think that the time maps of Asada's autobiography and Breakfast of Champions will be an excellent site for showing how different structures mean different things in different contexts. And I'm hoping that this will be a means of developing a deciphering practice. And then when people ask what my original motivation for this, I think that it reveals new beauty in narratives, in the stories that we tell, and how we understand ourselves through these stories. So thank you.
Thank you.
We can open up for questions. Does anyone wish?
Maybe something between a question and a comment.
Sorry. I just saw James.
Oh, yes.
Sending a sign, a picture that I'm not sure what it is. Maybe we can.
1 minute.
Hello, James.
James?
Hi, I'm fine. I have no question.
Hello.
Oh.
No question.
Do you have a question?
No.
Oh.
Okay, just listening. Okay, Dion had a question. We are listening.
I just want to hear about using this framework for a close reading. And this is more on a practical level maybe than a theoretical level. Does that mean you do the time map first and then read the text, compile the time map, and then revisit the text? Or what's the process more or less there?
Yes, I think that it does mostly resemble that. It's a little more complicated once you've started making these, because I've kind of just warped my mind to the point where when I'm reading a text, these maps sort of just automatically appear in my head. And I sort of start getting a loose sketch of them as I'm reading the text from left to right. But it's not going to be, you can't lock it down exactly until you go back and graph it. So having that graph does make it easier to interpret within this framework. Yes, I think that the process that you described is more or less what it looks like.
Okay.
Maybe three other texts that you might, if you're talking about deep close reading or close reading and applying it, that might be interesting for you. Further interesting challenge is 18th century novel called Life and Times of Tristram Shandy.
Oh, yes, yes, of course. All those digressions.
That's one. The other one is Faulkner's Absalom.
Mm.
And then there's a French writer, Georges Perec, who wrote, I'm not able to read French, so I had to read in translation, called Life, a User's Manual.
Yes.
I think that's a particular challenge, to see your narrative and how that works, because those are three sort of exemplars of ways of writers using time and space in different ways.
Yeah, totally. And with Perec, I'd be very curious to see how that unfolds, because the narrative or narratives are structured spatially.
Yeah.
As like those rooms within the hotel, but then what happens when you look at it from a temporal perspective as opposed to a spatialized one? So yeah, I like that. It's been on my radar. I still need to pick up that book, but I was actually discussing that with one of my advisors on Friday. So that's a very good suggestion. And regarding Faulkner, my colleague Daniel Aureliano Newman at University of Toronto, he's also created some time maps. His one for Aldous Huxley's Eyeless in Gaza, I can show you that. I have that one here. That is right here. And he shows how this novel that critics initially said was that the anachrony was a gimmick, that it made no sense, and that it was just whatever. Well, Dan made this time map of the book and shows that, well, no, you actually have 4 clearly delineated timelines right here. It's not a mess. It's very well ordered, and by jumping between the 4 of them, it's actually something that Huxley does intentionally, because Huxley's, his family background is in biology. So he was actually familiar with cutting-edge biological theories, such as neoteny, which is that the theory beforehand was that we as people, or as organisms, just develop linearly. But neoteny was developed saying, no, we develop in parts at different rates. And he was basically demonstrating that this occurs on not just a biological level, but then on a mental level as well. And he shows his protagonist developing at different rates, learning lessons at different stories throughout the novel. So that's another close reading. And I bring that up with regard to Faulkner because Dan also has a time map of A Rose for Emily, which he hasn't published yet, so I haven't included here, but he shared that with me personally. So.
Okay, James, you said you had a question?
Yes, I'm wondering that since Sean's findings is based on textual reading, I'm wondering that if we apply the same methodology to visual films, would the result be the same, or is an experiment you've never tried before?
Yeah, very good question, very good question. I would say that it depends on the particular text in question. So I'm going to jump back to the time map for Rope and Mrs. Dalloway. So in terms of the feature of linearity, film can render that very, very directly with real time, whereas with the written word, it's incredibly difficult to demonstrate. But that's really only one facet of what's happening here. I think with other elements, narratives will display them differently, like an ellipsis in film versus an ellipsis in the written word. In film, for an ellipsis, Rashomon provides some good examples with that, where it keeps jumping back and forth between these three timelines. Whereas in text, if I jump back to Howard's End, you do see similar ellipses, but it's structured differently. But it's the narratives themselves. I'm not quite sure if that's with the mediums, with the medium using them differently. I think for this question, I would actually need to fully answer it for you, James. I would need to look at some more narratives to figure out more patterns, how different media employ these techniques differently.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question, or?
Yes, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, do we have more questions here? Sean, I just wondered, because I've seen most of the tables on the one axis is the fabula and the Shuzet, and it's according to time or pages. And the last one was interesting to me for the novel I'm reading, because the author also plays games with you as the reader. Oh, no, not this. Yeah, the one I'm trying to, this one, this one is next level. It's like, I need some classes. But the other one, I think it was the one just before, like this one is great for slide number 23. So it's just the one after this one. Yes. Okay. So what happens in my novel, it plays, I would say, somewhere between 1960 and 2000, with the exceptions of the author telling you, he discovered this manuscript 2 years ago, so that would make it 2016, 2017. But what he does with real-world information, so I don't know how much of a question I have, is he plays it off, saying he uses historical facts, like saying, Mrs. South Africa won in 1974. That gives you a clue as to the actual, something like that happened, but it happened in 1973. If you go and check. So it's interesting for the, it's not lying, because it says, that's the way he experienced it, so it was true to him. But it should be interesting to be able to map explicit discrepancies. Discrepancies when it comes to him giving the exact experience of the guy telling the story, saying he experienced it as being 1973, even though every encyclopedia will tell you, one in 1974. So those type of, explicit references to factual information, but then lying with 1 year and saying, no, but maybe that somewhere in another reality really happened in that year with that lady, those type of games we play.
Totally. And I'm bringing up Richardson's post-classical structures with that, because he offers a really good framework for thinking through these kinds of things. And so for that would most likely be contradictory narratives, where we are given conflicting information about this, where on the one hand you have what the encyclopedia says, and on the other hand you have what the character experiences. And with that, from the perspective of creating a time map, you are faced with a conundrum. Do you follow the character, or do you follow the encyclopedia? And from a narrative perspective, those are on equal footing. if anything, I would go with a character, I think. Another place where time pops up is a classic episode of The Twilight Zone, where the main character gets a watch, a stopwatch. When he pauses the stopwatch, time pauses. So if I were to render that as a time map, do I render it as a pause because the whole world stops, or do I render it as a straight line for the one character who's still moving? So that's kind of another conundrum right there that demonstrates the multiplicity of temporality.
Okay, and then just I don't know, maybe a silly question from a reader's perspective. I find that in a lot of scholarship, and even sometimes in my own reading, we don't do enough close reading. You immediately start drawing parallels that might not be necessary or even belong there. Do you find that when you use this kind of a geometric way of looking at the narrative, that the close reading is easier for you, that it's easier to confine yourself to a close reading?
I don't know if easier is the quite how I think about it. I would say that it's a potential inroad. For thinking in terms of time, it's a very good way to access what some of the things that the narrative is saying about time. But for other aspects, it would be excess, I would say. For close reading methods of saying like a particular theme that keeps popping up, if you're looking for a motif, it might be helpful in the sense of like, oh, you can identify a timeline where that motif keeps appearing, but it's not going to be as helpful as, say, like getting an ebook and just doing Control F for wherever that one word appears. So I would say that it depends on what you're looking for, what kind of close reading technique you're looking to do. So different tools for different subjects.
I have a comment, not a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm more on the lexicography side than the literature side, but since I'm in a digital humanities space, your presentation actually opened up a way of thinking to say what is possible in literary text, what we can do as Sadila, what our literary scholars are actually, what they can actually do with the novels that they are reading and so forth. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you for that comment. That means a lot to hear. So.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, anybody who wants to contact Sean, between me and John, we have his email address if you want to discuss something offline with him. I'm going to email him a lot to do all this very fancy broken line stuff. It's very nice. But if there's no more questions, I want to thank everybody for coming. And James also thanks everyone. And thanks, Sean. But I want to thank everyone for being here. And it's recorded, and I will just communicate with Leon. She knows people who works with video, so we can maybe make something nice, like also including the graphics in a more maybe streamlined. Yeah, we can make something nice for YouTube and have a, I don't know, research output type thing, and people can refer back to it. We will try and just modify the whole fading of the faces and the stuff. Okay, so if everybody's happy, I want to thank you and good luck with the rest of your day. Our day is ending, your day is starting.
And thank you all so much for being here, and hope to see you all soon.
Okay, Papa.
Take care.
I think Valencia met him, it sounds like.
Yes, I met him at Saturday.